Resuming debate, the honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise to put some thoughts about this motion on the record. I think, like a lot of people in Elmwood Transcona, my impression is that we'd kind of like to move on from this whole India trip issue. I mean, but there's a reason why it's hard to do that, and I'll come to that, Mr. Speaker. Why would we want to do that? Well, because the trip was a debacle from start to finish, and it is frustrating for Canadians to see from the outside a trip where it appears that more thought and planning was put into the Prime Minister's outfits than was put into the meetings that he was having over the course of his trip. And it's frustrating when it appears that more thought went into who he was going to bring along to cook his meals than there was who was going to be at political and diplomatic events. And so that's the impression I think a lot of Canadians have of the trip, and from what I can tell, it's a pretty fair impression. Yep. And so it's a frustrating thing, and it'd be nice to say that something came of the trip, but when you look for results having to do with the trip, I mean, the one concrete result that is going to have a direct impact on Canadians is actually the fact that the India's tariff on Canadian chickpeas went up to 60% within a matter of days of the Prime Minister leaving the country. Now, I can understand that Liberals may feel that this is a coincidence because they obviously don't put a lot of thought in planning into their relationship with foreign governments, or the India trip wouldn't have happened in the way that it did. But I would like to tell them that most governments actually do think about their actions and the consequences of those actions and the timing of their actions and the import and the meaning that that will have for other countries in the world. And so it's hard to believe that a government that does typically think about its actions, even though we may not always get that here, we know that governments across the world are doing that, would just as a matter of coincidence have that significant of a raise in tariffs shortly after a visiting head of government who they're obviously quite angry at, that it would just be a coincidence that that tariff rise happens on that timeline. I don't think most governments are as flippant as this one in their interactions with other governments, and so I don't take that to be a coincidence at all, Mr. Speaker. So that was one consequence of the trip. Then we were told that we were supposed to be really happy about the trip because it was great for trade, but of course the trip itself had a $500 million trade deficit. They talked about $750 million worth of investment being drummed up. I might not have all the numbers right on this, Mr. Speaker, but I think the number was $750 million, or it might have been $1 billion, and it was so it was $1 billion. Thank you to my colleagues for helping a guy out. It was $1 billion, $250 million of which was investment from India to Canada, $750 million of which was Canada to India. Now that seems like an unlikely outcome for a successful trade mission from Canada to India. I could understand if the Indian government planned a trade mission to Canada and came home with those numbers, that their citizens might be pretty pleased and feel that their government did a good job, but that's not the case. It's the opposite, Mr. Speaker. So a $500 million trade deficit on the trip itself and a significant raise in the tariffs for Canadian chickpeas appears to have been the outcome. So that's why Canadians are frustrated with the trip. I think it's why most of us would like to, certainly the Liberals would, like to put it behind us and forget about it, except that another negative outcome of the trip was that it needlessly had a really negative impact on the relationship between the two governments because of a lack of vetting, and we're trying to figure out where exactly that misstep occurred. A person convicted of political violence in India was invited to an event with the Prime Minister. So that goes beyond embarrassment. It's an international incident. And then compounding that was the fact that instead of owning up to a mistake within the either the Liberal Party or the government of Canada, or it's still not exactly clear where the error occurred or who was really in charge of the trip, whether the trip was for political purposes or official government business. I mean, this is part of the problem that we don't know. This person was allowed to get into that event, and of course, instead of taking responsibility, then the Prime Minister, and I think it's important to emphasize that, it was the Prime Minister, so it wasn't the National Security Advisor ad-libbing on his own, deciding to get into a political debate and cause an international incident all by himself. That's very hard to believe, Mr. Speaker, and I just say that because I want to reinforce that this isn't about calling into question the integrity or the judgment of the National Security Advisor. It was the Prime Minister himself then repeated the idea publicly that somehow it might have been a conspiracy of the Indian government in order to do this to embarrass him, when he really should have taken responsibility for what was an error, again, as I say, I mean, either on the part of the Liberal Party or the Government of Canada, and we're kind of sorting that out. And so it's that in particular, it's not just that it was a kind of fluffy extended photo op instead of a real government business trip. It's not that it actually ended up having negative trade consequences for Canada instead of positive trade consequences. It's that coming out of that trip, there was an international incident and a government that hasn't taken responsibility and has floated two competing accounts about, well, at least two competing accounts as to what happened. On the one hand, they have an MP that says, I take the blame, I was responsible, it's on me. On the other hand, they've got a Prime Minister saying, well, actually, it might have been a conspiracy of the Indian government. And the way that he chose to spread that theory was by sending his National Security Advisor into a media briefing and pushing that story out through that media briefing. So I think in order to really move on from this trip, people need to know what happened and how and who was responsible. And an important part of that story is understanding better what happened at that press interaction between the National Security Advisor and the media. And so what this motion asks is simply to get that National Security Advisor in front of the Public Safety Committee so that conversation can happen and parliamentarians can get a better sense of what exactly was said and reported and discussed at that meeting, and have the opportunity for cross-examination as well and asking some questions in case the account in itself isn't exactly clear and there's some extant questions, which is also appropriate, Mr. Speaker, so that we can get a sense of what really happened and then put this whole sordid affair behind us. But unfortunately, the Liberal government refuses to enable that final step, to be able to get to the bottom of what happened, to have some measure of accountability for what ultimately was a very poor judgment on the part of the Prime Minister, I think, to go out and promote that theory without any real evidence and without even really standing by it. I mean, if you're going to make that kind of allegation about another government, you have to be really sure of yourself, and you better also be darn sure what the point of doing it is and what it is you're trying to achieve. And in this sense, the whole thing kind of ties back to the original problem with the trip, is that the point and purpose it never was really clear, actually, Mr. Speaker. And I submit to you that that lack of clarity might have played a part in why the Prime Minister kind of shot his mouth off about a conspiracy in the Indian government instead of being precise about what he wanted to communicate and how. And it has all the dressings of poorly managed, I would say, but political crisis management. Oh no, we made a terrible mistake. We don't want to take responsibility for it. We don't want to own up to it. So what are we going to say in order to try and divert opinion? But I think this is where you get signs of Prime Minister who just, in a lot of ways, just doesn't have the experience and the tact, frankly, to conduct himself appropriately on the international stage. Because throwing another government under the bus without being willing to back it up, I think is something that's problematic. There are times when the Canadian government may well take on another government, but I don't think that was the point of the trip. I don't think that's what he was trying to do, and I don't think he's substantiated those claims and doesn't seem to care to substantiate those claims. So it's just a real mixed bag, and I think, as I say, I mean, people would like to move on, but I do think we need some answers before we're able to do that, because we're in the awkward position of having our governing party, our Prime Minister and his members of his caucus providing contradictory accounts of what happened. So let's get one story and get it straight and then move on from this, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.